Hello everyone, Mr. Moomaw here, welcoming you back for another tour through U.S. history. You might notice the image looks a little different. Today I'm going to be recording on a different computer. My other computer, I'm getting some kind of weird sound problem. I think it's actually what was causing the problem the other day when I tried to go live in your class. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with that. I'm going to try to figure it out. I'm going to take it to Best Buy, let the Geek Squad sort it out, whatever. When I talk to you guys today, I want to talk to you about World War I. America's involvement in World War I is relatively limited. We only really come in on the last year of it, but our involvement is pretty decisive. And World War I, what happens in World War I is going to affect the United States profoundly because World War I sets a whole bunch of things on their course throughout the 20th century. And since the 20th century is going to be when America just dominates the world culturally, economically, militarily, and all these other ways, World War I is going to be very important for understanding everything that happens to America after this. So, with that in mind, let's continue on. Also, one more thing, I may not be able to incorporate my slides into the video. This might be a little bit different because of my computer situation, but I will be sending the PowerPoint with the email that goes with this video, so you'll be able to look that up. Also, I'll try, can't promise I will be able to put the slides on the very far end of it, but you will have access to the PowerPoint, that I can tell you. All right, so World War I begins in Europe with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Now, who is Franz Ferdinand? Franz Ferdinand is the son of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. If you're asking where that is, well, that place doesn't exist anymore. You got Austria, you got Hungary. The empire is gone. In fact, after World War I, almost all of the empires are gone. It's one of the major consequences of the war. Well, anyway, Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's a bunch of Germans that rule over a bunch of other people, and a lot of those other people want to be their own countries or unite with countries outside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A lot of Serbian people in Austria-Hungary, they want to be part of Serbia, which is a country outside, and a lot of these people resort to terrorism. Groups like Sonaruka, the Black Hand. These guys bomb, assassinate, things like that. And a group of these Sonaruka guys decide they're going to assassinate the Archduke, which they do. They assassinate him while he's in downtown Sarajevo, him and his wife. And this kickstarts a whole nasty chain of events. Austria wants to punish Serbia, but Serbia's got a friend, Russia. So if Austria is going to punish Serbia, it has to figure out some way to also deal with Russia. So Austria goes to its friend, Germany, and says, Germany, if Russia gets in on this, will you have our back? Germany says, yes. Germany, though, has to worry not only about Russia, but also France and Britain on its other flank. All of this happens because of all these entangling alliances and empires that developed during the 1800s. All these countries, they were all around the world, conquered all these places, ruled all these other places, and they kind of turn on each other. There's intense competition for who's going to dominate Europe. Germany, the new country, starts in 1871, is a big player now. Everybody else is trying to rush to keep up with them. So for all these reasons, there's this conflict is inevitable. The shape the conflict takes is not, but all this stuff eventually happens. Would it have happened if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated? It's really impossible to say. It's a what-if history. But that's what does happen. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand kicks off a whole series of these events. Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria, Germany gets in it with Russia, France and Britain get in it with Germany, and then everybody's sucked in. Italy gets into it, Ottoman Empire gets into it later on. One thing about the story today, I'm not talking about World War I as a whole. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on with World War I that we're not going to mention. I'm pretty much focusing on the Western Front because it's an America-centric thing. It's when Americans get involved in it, and that's kind of where we're at. So, the Germans, they realize they've got a problem. You know the geography, you kind of understand what's happening here, because Russia over here in the east, France over here in the west, and Germany's going to get attacked from both sides. Now, the Germans have thought about this for a while. They know these people aren't their friends, and they've kind of had cooked up a plan here the preceding decades. It's called the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan is basically, oh, look, you know, Russia's going to take way longer to mobilize than France is. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to position our armies. We're going to mass them all on the western border. We're going to march into France, sweep down through Belgium, encircle the French army, force them out of the war quickly. Then we can take all our guys, ship them across Germany, and fight Russia. Defeat in detail. It's not a bad plan. In fact, it's probably the most logical thing they could do. Problem is the German high command, they get kind of antsy and they don't really commit enough men to this. So the Germans go blazing through Belgium, they encircle the French army. They fight a huge battle, the Battle of the Marne. The Battle of the Marne is absolutely horrendous. And part of the reason it's horrendous is, apart from the large numbers of men involved, you're talking about 2 million people involved. You have all kinds of inventions that are making war way more horrible than it ever has been before. Don't think of this is the 1800s, bright uniforms and plumes and sabers and cavalry and all, some of that. Whatever there is left of that goes away very quickly. What you have in this war is the technology of the Second Great Awakening applied to battle. What that means is now you've got repeating rifles, bolt-action rifles. Every time you work the bolt, pull it back, a bullet pops up out of the magazine, slides into place. This is basically the technology we have today. Some of the materials are a little bit different, more advanced, but essentially the technology of a metal cartridge with a slug embedded in it with gunpowder and a primer at the bottom, being fired from a repeating firearm, that's what we still have. You also have much more advanced artillery shells that fire not just exploding shells that blow up like a grenade in a small area, but explosive shells that are packed with TNT that hit the ground and blow up and create a swimming pool-sized crater. You've also got machine guns, fully automatic weapons, which is to say, as long as you depress the trigger, bullets go and go and go and go and go until everybody's dead, until you run out of bullets. And of course, the technology is a little more advanced than that, or a little more complicated than that. You have to have some kind of casing on it or some way to cool the barrel, because if you fire all those bullets, basically it starts to melt. But these weapons change war, and what's bad is that people don't really appreciate how much they're changing war into the war. And by that point, the body counts have piled up. People have turned to all kinds of other technologies. Things are nasty. So the Battle of the Marne, the Germans are stopped, and they are pushed back at the cost of about 500,000 casualties. And the Germans are pushed back essentially to right where France and Belgium and Germany all come together, and they form this line that runs really from the English Channel all the way down to Italy. And that's going to be where everybody stays pretty much for the rest of the war. Sometimes they'll advance a few miles, sometimes they get pushed back a few miles, but for the most part, it is the stagnant, stalemate trench warfare. Everybody is just stuck in one place. Guys come out of the trench, they charge across, they get mowed down by machine gun fire. Then they counterattack on the other side, charge across, get mowed down by machine gun fire. They're dead. That's about every battle for the rest of the war. People just charge out of their trenches, getting killed by machine guns and artillery, left out there in no man's land to die. Now, that's trench warfare. War being fought in these trenches. You dig a big ditch, basically, so you don't get picked off by snipers, because these rifles are just as accurate as modern rifles. Slap a scope on it and kill somebody from 1,000 yards away. They don't even see you coming. So everybody's in these trenches most of the time. You fire artillery at the enemy and you charge at them like I described. This kind of warfare is very, very favorable to the defender. It's really hard to get to where he's going, so basically it's just a series of charges, back and forth, back and forth. No one really makes any progress. Now, to break the stalemate of trench warfare, people start turning to different ideas, one of which is a very characteristic weapon of World War I, poison gas. You'll see, for example, early on, chlorine gas gets deployed. I don't know if you guys know this about chlorine. You've been at a pool, especially a hotel pool, where they just jack up the chlorine content in the water to just kill every living thing, burns your eyes. Well, imagine a sickly green-colored cloud rolling along the ground towards you. Chlorine gas is a variant on different kinds of pesticides they developed, heavier than air, so they roll along the ground, kill all the bugs and rats and everything like that. Well, it works fine on people too, and the great thing about having a gas that rolls along the ground is it rolls right into those trenches, and then you either got to get out of the trench or you suffocate to death. Originally it was just like you go to Chuck E. Cheese or something like that. They have the helium tanks, you felt the balloon on them or whatever. The Germans who first started deploying this would just wait for the wind to blow the right way and crank on the tank and let the chlorine gas blow toward the enemy. Obvious drawback of that, of course, it can blow back on you. So eventually, of course, they figured you could put it out in shells. You put the poison gas in an artillery shell, fire it at the enemy, blows up, and then gas cloud. And the gas gets worse. You end up with mustard gas, which is a blistering agent. As soon as the mustard gas touches your skin, it just burns holes in you. burns out your eyes, your mucous membranes, tear ducts. If it gets in your lungs, you just die hacking up blood. It's really, really horrible. And the battles keep getting worse. Poison gas doesn't really turn the tide. Eventually, both sides will use it. Both sides will use poison gas, doesn't turn the tide, and so you get this trench war stalemate. Things really come to a head in 1916 with the Battle of the Somme. Douglas Haig, basically, Battle of Somme is the biggest battle in the Western Front in World War I. But just to give you an example of how trench warfare, I don't want to say works, it doesn't work. It's interesting to look at the Battle of the Somme and how it played out. Douglas Haig, the British commander, looks at the situation as, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to fire a bunch of artillery shells at the enemy. We're going to get out of our trenches and charge toward them and take over their trench, like we've tried and failed to do for 2 years at this point. But this time, with more artillery. So Haig orders this artillery barrage. Goes on for 3 days and nights. Just boom, 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 boom. Millions of shells hit the German lines. Literally millions of shells. And the British High Command and French High Command, they're very confident now of victory, so they send their guys over the top. The Germans, though, have been in their positions for so long, they've actually dug entire underground bunkers. So when the shelling starts, the Germans just go underground to their bunkers, and then wait it out, and play cards, hang out, and then when shelling stops, they go back up to the top, man their machine guns, and wipe out the British and French soldiers charging at them. To the tune of 50,000 dead men in the first day and something like 600,000 casualties over the course of the battle, which will go on for about 3 months. To put that in perspective, the entire Civil War is about what you end up with that. It's pretty horrible. And of course, nothing's gained. The British and French are not able to move forward. Even that, nothing significant is gained from this battle, from all those men being killed. So, try some new technology. Planes and airplanes. One thing that you see during World War I is, like we talked about before with the Industrial Revolution, Second Industrial Revolution, anything that can be used for something positive is also used, can be used as a weapon. Talked about steel in that regard, pesticide, poison gas, about the same thing. Airplanes get developed in 1903 in America. Big contest big conflict, I should say, between Ohio and North Carolina over who gets to claim the fame of being the place where aviation is born. Wilbur and Orville Wright, born in Ohio, did their work in Ohio, tested it out in North Carolina, so make of that what you will. But airplanes advance way beyond. 1903, an airplane is basically a kite with a lawnmower motor on it. By 1914, when the war starts, airplanes are pretty sophisticated, and as the war goes on, they get even better. You get the biplanes and triplanes. Eventually, they figure out you can mount a machine gun to the front of it and point the plane at what you're aiming at and just fire that way. Close air support, which is to say airplanes used to support ground troops. Reconnaissance, flying out and looking at the enemy positions and coming back. Fighting off the enemy's planes as they're coming in, air-to-air combat. So airplanes develop all these abilities during World War I. And when you consider how advanced things get, how quickly, by the 1980s, you've got jets that can fly faster than the speed of sound, armed with nuclear missiles, laser-guided bombs, all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, you're talking about really a span of, hair over 60 years. You go from, canvas and wood to that. And that's pretty amazing. During World War I, you also see the development of the tank. Obviously, having a vehicle that can go out and combat's a good thing. You try to slap some steel plates on a car. It doesn't really work, though, especially when you're talking about this no man's land of trench warfare, where it's basically just this big pile of mud right in the middle of your field you're trying to go across. So you need some kind of tracked vehicle. The British developed this at first. They're so secret, they describe it in official documents as a water tank. Hence, tank. And originally, they're just machine gun platforms, basically. A big armored vehicle rolls across no man's land. Machine guns are firing out of it. But eventually, when the other side gets tanked, you need somebody to knock out their tanks, hence the cannons. So tank technology advances very rapidly, and you're going to see by World War II, tanks are going to become a very, very important weapon. Now, as this combat goes on, it takes its toll on the men. Not just physically. Obviously, a lot of people are being seriously wounded and people are being killed at this. But even the people who don't suffer actual physical wounds, there is still the psychological damage. Now, Later on in World War II, Army doctors will actually go in and do surveys and tests and things like that. And the research they do, they come to the conclusion that a man has got about 50 days of combat in it. After 50 days, he starts to break down. He starts to lose the ability to sleep. No matter how exhausted he is, he loses the ability to sleep. When you don't sleep, your brain, things start to go really wrong. You hallucinate. Your temper goes down to nothing. You react to any harsh stimulus with just rage and focused attention and aggression. If you look at war, when atrocities happen, typically it's men who haven't slept in days. Can really wreak havoc on your mind. I remember reading about guys who were doing Army Ranger training in Central America, and they'd been in the jungle, they'd been up for days and days. One guy just walks over to a creek and picks up frogs, starts swallowing them whole. Another guy tries to he thinks he's putting money into a vending machine, he's just pressing his thumb on a tree, that kind of thing. And those guys have guns. The term for this, well, of course, as you're breaking down from not sleeping, you're also developing other physical problems. In addition to all what the combat does to you, the shaking, people's hands will start to shake, you'll lose control of limbs, you lose the ability to talk, you'll go temporarily blind. Nothing wrong with your eyes, you just cannot see. The term that develops during World War I for this is shell shock, the idea that a man has just been psychologically damaged by combat and is unfit to fight anymore. And they develop all these euphemisms for it over the course of the decades. In World War II, it's battle fatigue, and then by Vietnam, coming out of Vietnam in modern times, you get post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There are relatively nice, clean clinical terms, or at least kind of jargony terms for something that's obviously very awful. These are wounds that you can't see. These are wounds that stay with people long after the actual combat is done, that affect people's lives. A guy who looks perfectly physically healthy, mentally can be broken down and severely damaged. Those of you who have relatives who've been in combat, a lot of you may have experienced something like this, and you can relate firsthand to what I'm talking about. In World War I, this is where it first becomes a big problem, and it's where you start to get early psychiatry and neurology involved investigating this phenomenon. Now, eventually, well, what happens? Well, the war just keeps going. Governments have to convince people to keep fighting. They draft people. They ban criticisms of the war. And even though it would make sense for everybody just to stop fighting, at this point you really can't. These governments are financing the war by borrowing money. They've borrowed money from their national banks. They've issued out bonds. And at this point, you have to keep fighting so you can force the guy who loses to pay. And you keep borrowing more money to keep it going. It's this horrible cycle. Well, the whole thing comes to a head really in 1917 with the Nivelle Offensive. French army, General Nivelle, they go over the top, and they get slaughtered as usual. But what's significant about the Nivelle Offensive is that after the Nivelle Offensive, the French army mutinies. They say, no, we're done. We're not fighting anymore. Now, when one soldier says, I'm not fighting, throws down his gun and walks away, you arrest him and shoot him for mutiny. When everybody does it, you've got a real problem. So the politicians go out to these soldiers and they tell them, look, just at least promise to defend the territory. We won't send you on any more pointless assaults, but at least defend. And they get the guys to do that. But by the time when you're at a point now where you're negotiating with your own soldiers, you've really fallen apart as an army. Fortunately for France, and one thing these politicians are able to say to these soldiers is, guys, the Americans are coming. Because it's at this point in 1917, the United States finally becomes involved. And the United States becomes involved in the person of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson becomes president in 1912 largely as a result of a split ticket. Theodore Roosevelt runs against the Republican William Howard Taft as a third-party candidate. This splits the vote, and so Woodrow Wilson, while winning a minority of the minority of the voters, ends up as president because half the Republicans went with Theodore Roosevelt instead of Taft. Wilson is originally from Virginia, ends up in New Jersey. Pardon me. Ends up in New Jersey. As the president of Princeton University, he's a PhD in political science, a man who writes important works about the Constitution. Moves on from Princeton to become governor of New Jersey, and then runs for president. Woodrow Wilson is a progressive, kind of in that strain of Theodore Roosevelt, although Theodore Roosevelt hates him. He's in a different party and has some different ideas, or very different ideas in some cases. But Woodrow Wilson initially is very hesitant to get the United States involved in World War I. What happens slowly but surely is that, and there's no enthusiasm in America to jump in on this. There are a lot of elite people who want to be involved. People like Theodore Roosevelt has been chomping at the bit to fight in World War I from the beginning. But there are a lot of people who have these cultural ties, especially higher status Americans have cultural ties to Britain. But there's no real groundswell of we need to go to war with World War Germany, or if anything, let's go to war against Britain. There's a lot of Irish and German people in America who have no interest in preserving the British Empire. Well, a few things end up driving Woodrow Wilson to that. One is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Lusitania is a passenger ship. It's on its way to Britain, and the German U-boat, a submarine, sinks it. Now, you're not really supposed to be traveling in a war zone anyway. And in fact, the German government took out ads in newspapers throughout America. Don't take a cruise through a war zone. Nonetheless, the deaths of all these people are very shocking to Americans, and Germany is forced to Germany backs down, basically says, look, we won't do unrestricted submarine warfare anymore. We'll surface and make sure it's not a passenger ship we sink. That kind of blows over, but it does start the ball rolling on this idea that, maybe we do need to get involved in this. There's also the Zimmermann Note. The Germans, their secret spies and everything are active, and they're communicating with other governments about the war, and they communicate with the government of Mexico and say, listen, if the United States gets to war with us, you go to war with the United States, and then we'll help you out, and basically you'll end up with the rest of the Southwest America that you had to give up in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Well, nothing really ever comes of this. It's not really clear the Mexican government has any intention of jumping on board, but the fact that the Germans are willing to just get Mexico to attack us basically from behind while we're at war is enough to really just make a lot of people really question whether or not we should be involved in the war with Germany. We probably need to be doing something about this. And then there's Wilson's personality. Wilson sees himself as this world historical figure. Wilson believes that progress equals democracy equals America. He believes that if America is going to have a place in the world, it needs to have a seat at the table, at the negotiating table after this war. So Woodrow Wilson, for all those reasons and some more, asked Congress in 1917 for a declaration of war. Congress gives it, and the United States enters World War I, significantly starting in 1918. Now, what's happened in the meantime is that while the United States is declaring war on Germany, Russia is being taken out of the war. This one's important. We're going to talk about this more as we move along, but this is where it starts. In February of 1917, the Russian government is overthrown. The Tsars, the people who have been running Russia really since the Middle Ages, are removed from power. The Tsar abdicates and a provisional government comes in. Initially, this provisional government keeps the war going. By October, that government is failing, and the communists, the Bolshevik Party, headed by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, they come in, they take over power in a coup, and they pull Russia basically out of the war. Now, the communists, they're going to be important. It starts off small here, but that Soviet Union these guys found is going to become America's great antagonist throughout the 20th century. That's a little bit in the future, though. For now, what's significant about the Russian Revolution is that the Tsar is overthrown, the Bolsheviks, the communists take power, and Russia is knocked out of the war, which frees all those Germans who are fighting Russia to move over west and fight France. Now, pardon me. Sorry. Now, even though America has declared war on Germany, that doesn't mean everybody's on board with it. There are a lot of people in America who are kind of wondering, what's the point of this? Why are we doing this? Well, to help persuade people, the government, like all governments have at this point, resorts to propaganda. Propaganda is the government's production of information that's extremely one-sided and designed to appeal to emotions. Advertising, strictly speaking, isn't propaganda because it's a company trying to get your money or something like that. Government presents its information in neutral terms as a rational argument when really it's very, very biased and designed to appeal to your passions, your emotions. They know how to hit the man buttons. You scared? You scared? Do you not like freedom? What's wrong with you? All stuff like that. Propaganda really becomes a science during World War I. The government uses the techniques of advertising in order to get Americans on board. Woodrow Wilson gets a guy named George Creel and founds the Creel Committee, which is also known as the Committee for Public Information. And this is a government outfit with a neutral sounding name, not really emphasizing that it's really that well affiliated with the government, designed to convince Americans that war with Germany is awesome, that the American way of life needs to spread, that any criticism of the war is unpatriotic and hateful, and really does a great job in stirring up war fever throughout America. America goes from being a country that, why are we going to war, to a country that's just fanatically in support of it. People who oppose the war are beaten up, arrested, put in jail. Criticism of the war will get you stuck in prison for the duration. It's a lot of really harsh things happen to people who dissent from this. So the United States Army goes over to France. They fight in a lot of significant battles, Château-Thierry, Belleau-Wood, the Ardennes campaign, all that stuff. The individual campaigns aren't that important to know about because it didn't really take that long. What ends up happening, though, is that the United States forces Germany, or not, don't get the impression it's the United States alone. The United States, Britain, and France, the Allies, force Germany into an armistice, a ceasefire. We're not at the point of a peace treaty yet. Both sides agree, let's not shoot at each other for a while. And that's November 11th of 1918. While they're in the ceasefire, they start approaching each other. Let's see if we can solve this problem. Now, here's where Woodrow Wilson shows up. Woodrow Wilson goes over to Europe and comes over as a peacemaker. Woodrow Wilson shows up and says, I am here to be the face of America, to help these negotiations, to make sure that peace happens and things are secure. Woodrow Wilson has in mind his 14 points. What that means is Woodrow Wilson has 14 basic ideas for his idea of how the world should function after the war. Now, up to this point, the Allies have kind of indulged Woodrow Wilson. They have strung him along. Yeah, democracy, great, wonderful, da, da. Neither Britain nor France, nobody else, they have any intention of putting these 14 points into practice. 14 points are things like open elections, self-determination. In other words, the idea that, well, if you don't want to be part of this country, you can vote and leave it. Respect of different nations, freedom of the seas, all kinds of stuff, open agreements openly arrived at. Basically everything the British and French aren't doing. They have no interest in self-determination, which would essentially mean the end of their empires. They have no interest in treaties that aren't secret, none of that stuff. Wilson is really strung along, and bit by bit, he slowly comes to realize that nobody has any intention of doing what he wants. So Woodrow Wilson really starts to cling to this one part of his 40 points, the League of Nations. If only I can get everybody together in this league, in this organization, well, that'll help solve problems. Instead of us all fighting anymore, we'll work together and hash it out. And if one guy just goes off the reservation, starts attacking everybody, well, no problem. The others will join together and fight him. So Woodrow Wilson gets the Allies to sign off on this. And Woodrow Wilson, in turn, takes this back to the United States, says, it's a treaty, so Senate, go ahead and sign this. The Senate looks at this League of Nations and says, this looks suspiciously like American troops are going to be committed to fighting wars all over the world for the preservation of these empires. I mean, is America going to go to war if Ireland rebels against England, as it did during World War I? Is America going to be in India putting down revolts? Is America going to be in Chad, in the middle of Africa, French colony, trying to shut down stuff there when people rebel against France? Are we really committed to upholding the territorial integrity of these existing states, as this League of Nations would seem to say? So the League of Nations fails, and not for Wilson's lack of trying, though. Wilson goes, barnstorms across America on trains, trying to drum up support for it. Has a series of strokes along the way. Woodrow Wilson actually becomes incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. And there follows a bizarre episode where his wife and the Surgeon General collude to hide how sick the president is, and his wife is basically running the country for the better part of a year, for the final year of his presidency. It's kind of odd, but that's what happens. Sort of like that movie Weekend at Bernie's. You ever see that movie? The guy's he's dead, but everybody acts like he's alive. That kind of. Woodrow Wilson's not dead, but he's had strokes and he's pretty much incapacitated. So America doesn't join the League of Nations, and America never ends up signing the Treaty of Versailles, which ends World War I. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is signed between Britain and France and the countries, and then Germany, the Central Powers that were on that side. And here's what's significant about that. Germans had been told throughout the war that they were winning. The generals who were leading the German armies also occupied important roles in the German government. The government is essentially run by these generals at this point. They have tight censorship on the news. They're controlling the information that's getting to the people at home. Germany has been blockaded. Between France and Britain, they managed to keep pretty much any food or supplies or anything from getting into Germany. So German people are suffering, they're starving, they have a lot of problems. But they're being held together by the fact that we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And then, when the Treaty of Versailles hits, these generals basically realizing that they've now backed into a corner, they refuse to sign it. They resign their jobs. A civilian government comes in. The Kaiser, the King of Germany, abdicates. Emperor of Germany abdicates. The civilian government comes in, and they're the ones who end up signing the treaty. So, everybody in Germany is looking at this, and they're saying, what happened? We were winning. No Allied army invaded Germany. We have a big army. It's still in the field. How did we lose? What happened? Well, the generals were running things. Things were going great. The Kaiser abdicates, and now you get these civilians in, these cowardly civilians. We were stabbed in the back. Germany wasn't defeated, it was betrayed. It wasn't crushed by enemies from outside. It was handed over to those enemies by enemies within. This is the stab in the back legend. Germany wasn't defeated, it was betrayed. Look at all these civilian leaders who happen to be of Jewish descent. What's up with that? Sitting in his hospital bed, having recovered from being mustard gassed, is young Corporal Adolf Hitler. He's temporarily blinded, and he's sitting there in the hospital bed when the guy comes in and says, "Oh, Germany, we lost. We're surrendering. We're signing this Treaty of Versailles," which forces us to admit all the guilt for the war, pay all the war debts of all the Allies, have no real army to speak of, the Navy gets scrapped, all this other stuff. Germany is broke and humiliated as a result of this Treaty of Versailles. Please understand its total significance. Adolf Hitler says, "At that moment I realized my destiny. I realized that I was going to devote my life to politics and I was going to redeem Germany and put Germany back on the right path." And the story of how that happens, well, we'll talk about that later with World War II. So, if this video doesn't have everything my other videos typically have, I apologize for that. I've had to go to plan B with a different computer that's not anywhere near as good as the one I typically use. I was looking at the clock, sorry. So I apologize for that. I will send everything with me, though, and you will have this for tomorrow. So, thank you very much. I will see you all later on, and have a nice night. Day. Well, it's night here, so nice night, day. See you later.